CompTIA Pentest Plus. Now, this is a new exam as of the end of March, and I just want to make sure that you're aware of the exam and what's covered in the exam, my thoughts on the exam, and how you can participate in the beta exam, which is a lot cheaper than the production exam when it's released. You're looking at $300 versus $50. And my thought is that the beta exams are a good way to pass a little bit easier than the production exams in general. And I'll explain why here in a second. Let me just introduce myself before we get started. My name is Joe Holbrook, owner of Cloudbursting Corp. I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida. I've been working on cloud architecture, technical training. I've been focused mainly on IT security, data storage, with a real focus lately around cloud security as well. Now, I've been in the business for over 17 plus years, essentially. I spent about 10 years working on Department of Defense contracts, military for that matter. Now, when it comes to IT security, I really focus on cryptography, secure communications. I'm also a CompTIA subject matter expert. I was able to participate in the Cloud Essentials and the CompTIA Cloud Plus exam development, the first versions of those exams. I pretty much hold every CompTIA cert with the exception of the Server Plus, I think. So with that said, there's probably some feedback you'll gain from listening to this video. Now, one of the things about CompTIA is they are really, really good at developing exams. And their objectives are really clear. And I like to sum it up like this. If you can't pass a CompTIA exam because they give you everything to pass it in the first place, then you may need to reconsider what you're doing when it comes to IT with other exams, from other vendors, because they generally don't do as well as CompTIA. But let's go ahead and find out more about the exam and what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk about what the CompTIA Pentest is, talk about the exam objectives. We'll go through the exam format, the type of questions, how long it takes. We'll also go ahead and talk about frameworks you may want to look at to prepare for the exam. I'm going to touch on DoD 8570, and you could certainly expect this to be approved down the road by the DoD. For example, if you have the CYSA, the Cybersecurity Analyst, this will be likely at the same level. This is an intermediate cert, and this is a step above Security Plus. So I'll talk about observations of the exam content and the exam itself, sort of give you some ideas of maybe where you want to study. And I do have a course coming out as well. Right now, I don't see any courses out there focused on this content as of the end of March. So I hope to be one of the first to have some kind of formal content around this exam. And you can check for that on Udemy here in the next few weeks. What is the Pentest exam about? Well, the Pentest exam is a certification for intermediate level cybersecurity professionals. So intermediate means what? That's going to be 3+ years generally, plus or minus a year, depending on your experience. When it comes to your specific tasks that you're going to typically be attending to, it's going to be more focused on identifying, exploiting, reporting, and managing those vulnerabilities on a network. Now, when they say network, that's not, so this exam here is not just the network. It's going to entail mobile and Wi-Fi as well. So just be aware of that. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the objectives. Duties for a pen tester. I won't read all these out, but this is how essentially the objectives were derived from. Now, one of the things that you learn when you're developing an exam, and I've had the opportunity to develop a lot of exams, is that you want to identify the roles that you're going to test against and create objectives and sub-objectives against those roles or duties. So this is essentially what the pen tester exam is about. Planning and scoping and assessment, legal and compliance requirements, vulnerability scanning that is, pen testing, etc., analyzing results, producing a report, communication, and practical recommendations. Now, let's talk about the objectives more in detail, because this is one of those exams that you're either going to fit into or you're not going to fit into. And it's important to understand what the objectives are, what you're going to be tested on before you take this exam. This is not like Security Plus. This is not IT fundamentals. This is actually a very specialized exam, very focused exam. And that means you need to be a little bit more specialized than perhaps you would be with Cloud Plus, Security Plus, Network Plus. Let's go ahead and find out what these objectives are. The first is planning and scoping, information gathering and vulnerability identification. Just as a note, I'm going to go through each of these domains one by one, and each of the subdomains as well. We're just going to scan these first, and then we're going to talk more about these individually. Attacks and exploits, pen testing tools, and reporting communication. Now, looking at the percentage of the exam, there's one percentage that sticks out pretty significantly. That is attacks and exploits. You're definitely going to want to know about attacks and exploits and the different types of those exploits and attacks and how you can scan against them and determine what they are. And, you know, this is actually, and I'm going back on what I was going to say, because this I had another thought, and here's my thought, is this is like literally almost a third of the exam. If you're not confident, you can talk about a SQL injection, you can talk about Smurf attacks, Wi-Fi jacking, blue jacking, you name it. This is going to be an exam that you're going to have a lot of issues against. The second is vulnerability identification and information gathering. That is over 50% of the exam, just 2 objectives. So let's talk about what they are. The first objective is planning and scoping. Now, this is really more or less information gathering, putting stuff together, trying to understand where you're at. When it comes to really getting focused in this area, you want to be able to understand, for example, compliance requirements, understand HIPAA, understand PCI, for example. You won't be tested directly on those, but at least identify those as compliance issues that you may have to run assessments for. When it comes to legal concepts, for example, discovery, right? Being able to document, have a chain of custody, right? Those are going to be the objectives. Now, let's go ahead and pull up the PDF document and talk more about that. Now, this is the pen tester exam objectives. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole document with you, but I want to lead you in the right direction to do the work yourself. And if you do take the course that's coming out in a few weeks, then you'll have all this done for you. But if you don't have the time or can't afford to do it before you take the beta exam, before it expires, at least you know where to start. Now, CompTIA, they do an amazing job with objectives. My whole thought, again, is this. If you don't read the objectives and study against them and you fail, it's probably your fault. It's just so basic to print this out and identify each of those areas. Now, let's go ahead and cover 1.0. For example, disclaimers. Why do you need a disclaimer? One of the things on the exam that I want to point out that I thought was interesting was identifying SOAP project files and SDK documentation. Now, Swagger documentation. Again, if you don't know these terms, look them up or take the course. When it comes to key legal concepts, for example, statement of work, right? Managed service agreement, non-disclosure agreement. Know these terms, know what they are. Like I said, you'll get tested on at least 2 or 3 of these in here, and you'll want to know. And this is actually a very simple area. This is the theory part. Very simple to pass this area. Types of assessment, right? I always like to point out whenever I'm teaching any kind of class, whether it's security or cloud, for example, I like to just point out terminology because it's very easy to confuse terminology and what it means, especially on this exam. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of acronyms to know. And then 1.4, right? Compliance-based. Now, when it comes, like I said, you don't need to know per se anything more than HIPAA or PCI, what they mean, but you don't need to know the specifics of those compliance requirements. You just want to know that those are compliance requirements that some organizations may have to attend to. Generally with compliance requirements, there is generally going to be real specific instructions or details you have to abide by. Now, when you're abiding by those objectives, you want to be aware that there may be regulations involved. For example, data locality could be an issue. That could be, data isolation, right? You don't want to intermingle data. If you have PCI information around credit card information, you don't want to intermingle that, of course, with personal identifiable information. I mean, it goes really straight to the point there, right? So just pay attention to that. Objective 2, right? Look at the objectives here and try to make sure that you understand that there's going to be gathering information techniques that you're going to want to know. For example, how do you inspect packets, fingerprinting, right? Sources of information, right? Everybody should be familiar with CERT, NIST, JP CERT, CAPEC, disclosure, CVE, right? These are very common security requirements, security best practices, security resources. These are just things you gotta really take a look at. Vulnerability scans. Again, I won't go through every one of these. I just want to point that out just so that you can refer to this document more in detail. When we go through the course, this is like literally almost a 3.5-day course. There's a lot more detail, a lot more specifics we're going to be able to cover than what we could do in about a 30-35 minute presentation. Now, when it comes to objective 2.0, again, this is collecting information, identifying vulnerabilities. Just be aware, you really need to know eavesdropping. You want to know sniffing, right? Understand wired and wireless sniffing. Understand that, again, you could be sitting in a Starbucks and someone could, set up a rogue point of access, right? Very common. Another thing too to point out, like 2.3, right? Given a scenario, you want to be able to look at the results and categorize those results. Try to identify what is a positive and what is a false positive, for example. When it comes to Domain 3.0. Now, one of the areas about Domain 3.0, this is the domain that really has a lot of weight, right? Attacks and exploits. You really, really want to know this area inside out. This is what, 30% of the exam, right? This is an area you have to really do well on to pass this exam. Social engineering. Understand different ways that hackers, attackers, goofballs, whatever you want to call these people that try to exploit your enterprise. Just realize that they're going to try to attack your organization in many different ways. One of the ways to do that is through social engineering. Phishing, for example, spear phishing, know those terms. Know what whaling is, right? Understand that attacks could be basically sent through USB drives, right? People share USB drives. Understand the motivation of these people, why they want to collect information. One of the best ways to determine a vulnerability is to understand your enemy, right? Now, 3.3, right? Try to understand from a network perspective some of the protocols that could be exploited, right? Most folks in the IT industry understand that FTP, right? SNMP, SMTP, right? DNS, these are not the most secure protocols. When it comes to wireless and RF based, right? These are other protocols that are not known for their security. Be aware things can happen. For example, it's very common for basically hackers, or what I call opportunistic engagers, basically, to want to hang out at a Starbucks and set up a rogue point of access. They also, too, a lot of what I would call less experienced folks using mobile devices. They don't realize that they could be bluejacked with their phones, right? If they leave, these protocols on, right? Bluetooth, for example. There could be other types of attacks, for example, evil twin attacks, of course, right? RFID cloning, so on and so on. Now, when it comes to the remaining objectives, I just want to touch on a few other things just to speed it up. Understand different application vulnerabilities, right? SQL is going to be a big one. You're going to definitely see a couple tough questions, at least on the beta, around SQL. Understand SQL, understand the syntax of SQL. I would recommend that you do. Another area is going to be CSS and XSS, right? The scripting, the cross-site scripting, that's a big area they test on as well. And lastly, another area that I saw is around scripting and being able to be exploited around that, for example. Putting in, there's a question around, do you hard code credentials and why or why not? Also, too, deciphering error messages, right? And again, there's a lot more to cover, but I just want to touch on a few points. Now, 4.0, this is an area too. This is your experience area here. Again, it's one thing to memorize types of attacks, but it's another thing to look at a performance-based question, right? And try to determine what the problem is or how you can exploit that solution, for example. Now, when I say exploit, basically I'm sort of saying, are you going to be able to engage that as a vulnerability or not? Are you going to be able to determine that as a positive or a false positive? A lot more to talk about in this area. When it comes to testing tools, it goes without saying, you need to know a wide set of tools. Some of the tools you're going to need to really know from a syntax perspective, like SSH. You'll definitely want to know Metasploit. You'll definitely want to know OpenVAS, Nessus. These are tools you have to play around with. Another tool when it comes to networking is Wireshark. A couple questions there. Another area that you might want to know about is Google Dorking, wireless as well. Understand web proxies, right? OWASP, that's another area that I saw tested as well. Now, the next objective, reporting and communication. Now, this I think is probably, this is going to be an easy section for some people and perhaps a little bit more challenging for others. Now, when it comes to reporting and communication, I wouldn't say, I guess a fair amount, I wouldn't say a lot, but a fair amount of the questions in this section was really based on you looking at a script and debugging the script, or you looking at code like Python or PHP and trying to determine what the issue is, or running a tool set and trying to decipher from that tool set like Metasploit. Now, another area too in 5.0 that I think was interesting was basically delivering reports. Understand what an attestation is. That's a term that seems to be pretty unique to white hat, for example, in a lot of cases. Another term you may want to know as well is going to be around risk. A term that, honestly, I didn't know on top of my head immediately. It was easy to figure it out, but it was called risk appetite. Okay, what is a risk appetite? So this really is more risk management. Another area to consider too, making sure that you're aware of, is communication during the process, right? When it comes to communication, how do you escalate, de-escalate, prioritize your risks, essentially? So that was a quick review of the objectives. You really need to go click the link, go ahead and download the PDF and go at it, because this is going to be an exam that is going to be far and deep, and you definitely want to know the tools, you want to know the vulnerabilities. All right, let's talk about the format of the exam. It's 80 questions, or up to 80 questions, I should say. 165 minutes. You need a 750 out of 900. However, when you take the exam, you won't know how you performed until CompTIA gets enough test takers, basically, or beta performers, to take the exam. And then what they do is they close off the beta exam and go through how well people do. Basically, the top percent of the questions that people do really well on, they throw out. Generally, the bottom few they would throw out as well. Again, I'm not saying that's exactly how that happens, but generally that's how it was attended to in most cases. And the reason is, if the question's too easy or too hard, they want questions that, the median group of people should be able to answer appropriately. Now, where does this exam fit in? This is a new exam. It's an intermediate exam. And CompTIA saw an area, and actually two areas, where they needed to improve on, and that was basically around pen testing and cybersecurity analysis. Now, from a career standpoint, if you already have these, the next step would be pentester or cybersecurity analyst. A lot of this is going to depend, on what you want to do and what you're doing now. Does it make sense for you to go out and get both? I don't know. That's up to you. I just, you have to think about it from a expense perspective and time perspective. But there's definitely material that's redundant to Security Plus and each of the exams there to a degree. And my thought is I would get one intermediate and then get your CASP. Do you need to get, if you have CASP already, do you need to get the Pentest or CYSA? Probably not, unless if the role is calling for that for some reason. That again is up to you to determine from your career standpoint. Now, the exam details are here. This is on the web page. It says that when there's 400 people have taken the exam, or before April 25th, they'll go ahead and close out the exam. As of today, the 30th of March, it's still open. I understand that there's probably over 100 and something slots open, but the good part is whether or not you take the beta or you wait to take the production exam, it'll be the same question pool essentially. They may add a few questions, but in general, they're going to keep a good portion of the questions. You know what that amount is, I don't know, but that's more proprietary information anyways. $50 though, this is sort of my thought. If you're going to take a security cert, it's better to pay $50 for a $300 cert than to pay $300 for a $300. I'll leave that up to you to determine on what makes sense. Let's go ahead and talk about some frameworks. Now, this exam here, you'll want to take a look at the NIST special publications, the cybersecurity framework. The links will be in the description as well. Due to the length of the video time, I won't keep this too long. I want to cover a couple areas at the end I think is more important. Take a look at these links. One thing that I want to point out is if you haven't gone to the vulnerability database, you have to check it out. It's pretty cool. It actually is maintained pretty well. It helps you really determine what is going on, what are the real-time issues that are really being reviewed and assessed. So definitely take a look at this. There's also the NIST technical guide for security testing. This is a very important document. It's like 80 pages. You have to review this before the test. It's going to cover a good portion of the objectives, so definitely spend some time on it. Now, for those folks that are going to be focused in the Department of Defense, the State Department, ISO, chances are this exam will be approved by those appropriate agencies and organizations. But as of right now, it's going to take some time. I think, for example, with Cybersecurity Analyst, it probably took about a year for that to get through. So just be aware that there probably won't be an issue with it being approved, but who knows? Now, these levels here, if you're in the DoD sector, you already know where you fit in from an IAM or IAT level, for example. If you're more hands-on technical, like you're maintaining government PCs or government networks, you're probably going to need at least an IAT level 2, if not a 3 in a lot of cases. Perhaps IAM level as well. A lot of it just depends on what your role is and the level of management responsibility and technical responsibility. Here's my thoughts on the exam. This is really sort of the differentiator here. Again, the rest you could have got straight from the basic websites. Now, let me just tell you my experience so that when you take the exam, you have some things to compare against or perhaps use before you take the exam to prepare. The first thing is my opinion is the exam is clearly experience-based. you're not going to know how to do something in Metasploit unless if you've done it before, right? It's just really experience driven. Another thing too is, how do you handle a vulnerability? These are things that you're going to have to really deal with, especially in the performance-based area of the exam. Nmap, right? That was tested more than a few times. Trying to just be able to determine ports that are open, Metasploit as well, Nessus. I mean, just these are tools that if you haven't used them, then it's hard to intelligently answer a question against them. OpenVAS, for example, was another heavily tested. Now, there was at least, it looked like 10, maybe 15%. I didn't count exactly, but there was a fair amount of performance-based questions. Study material is not fully available at the time that I'm doing the video. About 10% of the questions were actually as well on specific tools like Nmap, OpenVAS, Nessus, so on and so on. So pay attention to the tool sets that are in the tool section. Essentially, that's going to be 4.0. Now, understand your software buggers, understand your software debuggers, I should say. Also, two scanners, right? Not just OpenVAS or Nessus, but understand another one that I saw was SQL Map. When it came to mobile tools, also that's an area that some people may be very weak in, is around mobile. That, again, know what APK Studio is. Another thing to point out is scripting. I was a little bit surprised that they covered scripting so much. I probably 6 questions maybe on scripting, at least 4 or 5, if not 6 questions total. And it really depends on how you looked at it. So for example, you'll get some Python code and they'll say that, this code has been determined to be an incorrect version, and is there a vulnerability in it, and what would you do to figure it out? Now, again, when it comes to code and looking at issues around code, if you're not a programmer, this might not be that easy. Like, how do you know what a string operation is versus an array, or what is encoding or decoding, right? I/O issues, another term that you'll want to know, is going to be variables. Know what a variable is and know what a substitution is. And again, take the course if that's a question around that. At the time being, though, if you already hold like GPEN or GWAPT, OSCP, or CEH, then a lot of that content is reusable for this exam. Now, each of those exams, each of those 4 exams I just, read off here, are going to be very different from each other, but a lot of the content is actually very good and could be used with these objectives. So I'll leave it up to you to figure out what you want to use to study for the beta exam. But until there's a formal course from a reputable author or organization, this is one of those exams you're going to have to just put together. If you have Security Plus or CAS pen testing materials in those sections, I highly advise you look at. Now, you could also go to YouTube, and there's this YouTube channel called Professor Messer. He does an amazing job with some of these subject areas, and a lot of the objectives will line up exactly to his Network Plus, Security Plus courses Mike Myers covers it as well. I have some areas covered, but these guys have been, pumping up videos on YouTube much longer than me. And I have to give them the respect they deserve. They cover these areas amazingly well. Understand the difference between the hats, know what a white hat is, a red hat, right? Review Metasploit. Get to know Metasploit, play around with it. If you don't know what it is, find a tutorial. Understand the exploits that can happen to SQL, right? SQL injections are going to be pretty common, right? Mobile. Okay, mobile exploits. This is an area that a lot of people are weak in. You may be very good at your enterprise network, your gigabit Ethernet, hardwired network. But mobile and Wi-Fi may be just your weak point. Know the exploits, know the tools. You have to spend time knowing these types of exploits, attacks that can happen. Know what bluejacking is. Also understand other issues that can happen around configurations. Mobile is one point before I forget. For example, with mobile, right? Just be aware that there's going to be some confusion sometimes between mobile and I think wireless, and they're really two different exploits. So just be aware of that. For example, an RFID clone is going to be different than bluejacking, and understand what a fragmentation attack is versus jamming, okay, and blue snarfing. Oh, one of so just to point this out, make sure you know blue snarfing and bluejacking. Those are terms you're going to see. So for example, if someone's got their mobile phone on and they have Bluetooth enabled, is it possible, you could use a tool set to exploit their phone? Yeah, you could definitely bluejack their connection, Password attacks. Okay. Now, there's definitely going to be a few questions on password attacks. Brute force, right? Brute force is what? You're basically trying to guess the password by going through typically a dictionary, a library approach in a lot of cases. Know the different tool sets out there, digest attacks that can happen as well. Now, as far as a course, like I said, there's nothing from anyone else on Udemy as of March. I hope to be the first one. Not that that really matters, because I'm sure it'll do well anyways. But my goal is to do a good course for the audience to make sure that you pass the exam and that you have enough practice exams to actually, perform well on the production exam. Because the beta may not be available by the time the course is actually fully available until the end of it. And my understanding is that this beta exam will go until the end of April, and chances are it might be less than that because of the fact that it seems like, at least the discussion I had last week with one of the folks at CompTIA, is that this is actually turning out to be a little bit more popular than they expected. With that said, I hope to see you online. Let me know any feedback that you get. I'm happy to pass it on to the rest of the viewers. Happy testing. Let me know how you did. Any other suggestions or areas I should cover, let me know. But once again, I'll do separate videos down the road on each of the objectives, I think. It's really hard to cover everything in, 45 minutes or so. With that said, happy testing.